Hey, how's it going? I think you're muted.
Was trying to remind my daughters like you have to
Okay.
be quiet because she's over there watching the last bit of FIFA going on, the World
Yeah.
Cup. So
Oh, okay.
like, don't be yelling. It's like,
Yeah. Okay. You, you know what? I'm streaming on YouTube too, so it's kind of like an echo. So I'm kind of like it's. I'm trying to keep a keep ahead because it sounds like it's like delayed a little bit. So if you see me looking kind of, that's just what it is.
I know that's okay. Stuff. So I understand that. So that just is a good communication tool between
Yeah.
people. So
So for those who are watching, session is labeled the Finding Your Research Gap. And the goal of this session is to hope that someone walks away with understanding and can take some of what we share from this topic and apply it to their research. So I want to start with introducing my guest. And she is someone that I met in my cohort, and she completed her PhD as well. And I've been genuinely looking forward to having this session with her since our last session again. And I want to welcome her back. And Dr. Katie Ballio, can you introduce yourself? Give us a little quick bio.
oh yeah, thanks. So yeah, my name is Dr. Katie Ballio. I completed my PhD formally last year. I'm actually going to walk for in San Antonio for Walden. So, because Walden only has two things, so I'm actually going to go because I'm from Texas. So it didn't make sense to go to Orlando, but no. And so my PhD was in human services, military families and culture, focusing on women veterans and how they use online forums for social identity. But to paraphrase that, I did 20 years in the Army. And I always say my day job is I work for Texas Veterans Commission. So being a veteran, working for veterans, and then I'm really active more so in the VFW, but I'm a member of several VSOs. So when we talked about gaps and me and everyone talked about being a veteran doing research on veterans, you can't say I know, you have to prove it, and so that becomes a very different thing. So it would, when we talk about the gap, and I'm sure we'll get into it, you can't use like there's stuff that as a veteran I may know, but as a researcher you have to prove it. You can't use your experience because as you don't have experience until you finish that degree and defend your topic. So becomes a little frustrating at times, but it gives you the insight, but it also can make it harder depending if you can't take yourself out of that.
It seems like you wore a lot of hats. So my next question is how do you blend those to show up when you're helping someone?
Hmm. So my professional experience, not just in the years in the military, I've worked for the VA prior to working for now. So I've worked 10 years now with Texas Veterans Commission. And so when I'm sitting right down with a veteran, because my job is to help them, as a veteran that meets the criteria set by Department of Labor who needs help, usually returning to job work. So I have to be able to address the all their needs and stuff, and why my job is employment focused. If there's a homeless veteran, there's veterans of mental health crisis, all those, I have to have a foundational knowledge. And so that's years of picking up experience. I mean, years of being around veterans, and sort of that leads into the PhD. Is like you have experience but you still have to back up your knowledge. I can't just say, hey, go see this, and without explaining why do you need to go someone. So it is different than sometimes what I say my day job compared to when I might be in a VFW or a women's veteran event just talking about veterans. So they all have they're all interconnected. It's just what's the focus on what am I doing right then and there?
So when a student says, I don't know my research gap, what do you think is actually going on with them?
I don't think they know their topic. And I don't mean to say that, or they're not. You made a point in a previous video, or I saw on LinkedIn, about how do you search for something? Because how we were explaining is, if I'm starting chapter 2, because I had to start chapter 2 first. I had to do lit review first. If you want to really figure out if you're in it for the long game, start with your lit review first. But they would say, read, I'm always veterans. So I have to go veterans. And then what am I using that on? And every single time you read an article or read a research, it says, what's the next steps? Or how can you improve? And that, to me,
Mhm.
it's like, if you can't, now that may not be the gap you're focusing on, but how many articles have you read to say, what's the next thing? So
Indeed.
every
Yes.
single one of them, and
Mhm.
real talk, that's in the abstract. So you sort of get to, like, okay, the abstract will tell you what's the topic. Okay, is it something
Mhm.
that I should be interested in? And then you go and look, what's the next step? So if you don't know what your gap is, either you're on the wrong topic or you really haven't narrowed down that research question. So, I mean, a lot of that, it just depends on what your focus. Like you and I talked about, veterans are really super broad, and you have to bring it down, down, down. And you should sort of know what you want to do your research on, but you have to
Mhm.
identify a gap. So you may have your topic, but if you can't identify a gap, then you need to change your subject. I know that's a lot simplistic, but you will wait. The gap is where, because somebody says, well, it's already been done.
Mhm.
Why do you need to do it? And it may be like, I will use my friend Dr. Strong Reese, as that she started out with post-traumatic, you know, it turned into survivors of Marie, right? But
Mhm.
somebody just literally said, well, if you take the same thing and go for post-traumatic growth, then all of a sudden there became the gap. So, it can be veterans, but you're looking at a lot of different studies. And if you're going to do, and I know you focused on pure sport, but I'm telling you, if you do veterans, and if you're going to do it in a mental health field, you
Mhm.
really, really, really got to know your topic, because
Yes. Oh yeah.
you
Yeah.
can't just say that, oh, I'm going to study veterans with mental health and the effects of this, this, and this. Well, you have to make sure, has that not been
Yes.
studied?
Mhm.
And if that's studied, why is your study different than theirs? And how are
Mhm.
you building upon the practice? And that's easy, hard, depending on the subject you want to. So hopefully you don't get to all the way down to your writing
Mhm.
without identifying. Because,
Okay.
and I don't know,
Yeah.
depending on which colleges, because this could be streamed for different colleges. I always try to, maybe not residency one, because residency one of Walden was like, ooh, what did I get myself into? Because they're throwing away terms, you don't even know it, you don't understand what's coming at you. But in
Mhm.
all of my schoolwork, if I had a chance, I'm trying to slide my topic there to do research on the side. And all my residencies were trying to gear towards that. Now, to be fair, I had to change my theory, but the gap was still there. So
Yeah.
you better be looking at that gap months before you do your proposal, because
Mhm.
you're going to have to, you don't have to defend it, but you're going to have to explain why. You're going to have to show, like, those 10 resources that we had to do, like, where it shows where's the gap, and where's the gap.
Mhm. I like what you just said of looking at that gap beforehand. Forward, I think that's the key also as well. And you said something else earlier on, you got to really know your topic. And I agree because I think when you pick a topic that's that you're passionate about, that you want people to know, you're going to find that gap. But if you pick something all because it's easy or it's just popular, I think that if it's popular, everybody's probably going to be doing research on that particular topic. But
Well, and I would probably say you have to know that your subject, but you also have to know now that gap may be that this was researched 10 years ago.
mhm,
So 10 years ago, those results stood.
that's
Is your
true.
gap
Yeah,
because every
that's a
single
good
thing
point.
that what we were taught, has to be 5 years
Mhm.
was the maximum
Like five
minus,
years.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
Hmm.
minus your lit review 5 years. So if your gap was something that happened 10 years ago, okay, so maybe it hasn't been recently studied and it hasn't been recently studied with this.
Hmm.
Or
Yeah.
sometimes it's the gap is a different population. So, like, when we got towards my end, it's like I had to be able to say, can my study be done with just male veterans? Since my study was
Hmm.
about women veterans, could you do the
Hmm.
same thing? And you're looking at all of those. And sometimes it's a totally different theory that looks at something from a totally different angle. So,
Hmm.
your topic because you have to defend. And I'm not talking about your oral defense. You have to, because when that chair comes back, well, why this source and stuff? And I don't know how many times, and I thankful that my chair was a veteran, but she would
Oh
come back
yeah.
and said, "Are you sure that's what they're
Yeah.
really talking about?" And you can't make a source be
Mhm.
something for your subject that it's not.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
picking ones and twosies and threesies words, okay, but those words better matter. So,
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm sorry if I keep looking over here. I got my notes over here. I'm trying to keep myself organized. But my next question will be, what's the difference between a gap that's genuinely researchable and something that's really just a curiosity without a direction?
I think that's when, what are you trying to prove? Because
Mm.
curiosity is great, but can you actually research it? And this
Mhm.
might be like you were talking about phenomenological, the case studies, grounded theory. Can you actually research it? Now, and sometimes that goes back to what is your field? Like my field was human service. So my focus has to be human service focused. So I can't just say, "Hey, I want to talk to women
Mhm.
veterans for this, this, this." And they were like, "Well, what does it matter if you do that? What theory are you using? What approach are you using? Because is it relevant? Does it do social change? What's really going to come out of that?"
Mhm.
And you have to, when you are aware of your topic, like myself being a veteran, working in the veteran field, you have to be really careful to be able to say, take yourself out of it and find those information. And I think I was thankful that I had a phenomenal methodologist who
Mhm.
wasn't a veteran. And
Mhm.
so as a veteran, I think it was something like veterans going to the VA, right? And so as a veteran, you're like, okay, veterans, not all veterans go to the VA. We already know that.
Mhm.
But and then she goes like, well, why don't all veterans, or she said something like, what, don't all veterans go to the VA? And you're like, no. But
Mhm.
we assume things, and so you have to be very careful for taking yourself
Yeah.
out of it. Just as a women veteran, it was probably like I had to define bias, because when you get to a certain point, and I know we're talking about the gap, but you have to be able to be a researcher and not a participant in your own study, meaning that
Mhm.
I'm a women veteran. i
Yes.
can't i can't think what they're going to say. I have to, like, what did they say? I'm not there to interpret that. That could
Mhm.
be chapter 5 depending on what's going on, but even in chapter 5 you have to define that. So when you're going to the gaps and you're trying to figure out a topic, it can't be just, oh, I want to do that. Well, okay.
Mhm.
If you want to do that, you better defend that to, like, why should it be studied? Maybe that's a better, why should it be studied? Well,
Yes.
because I just want to, isn't, we know that's
Mhm.
not what anybody's gonna say, but that will never work. You have to defend that. And it makes it, and I'm defending, and that you're constantly defending what your choices are and
Mhm.
stuff. And you may say, well, the gap is this. And I think, and with Walden and going through human service, I think trying to get that wording down,
Mhm.
when you're doing your proposal, it was like, okay,
Yeah.
oh, that's not the gap. That's not the gap. And if finally somebody said, no, it's about transition. And then you're like, it's about the
Mhm.
transition. It's like you're
Yeah,
trying to, and
yeah,
it's really those words matter, you know.
yeah, yeah. And I want to talk about this next segment as the common mistakes. And what are some mistakes you see over and over when you hear about students that are trying to identify their gap? Now that you're looking at it from graduating and from the outside looking in, what do you see or hear?
Um, I didn't I mean, we all heard about alignment. We heard it all. That was like the topic, and you don't understand how that really comes into play. And to be fair, part of it, I had to write my research question and put it on my additional computer screen because
Mhm.
it's so easy to go down that rabbit
That's-
hole because you're you're
yeah.
you're like, okay, well, this veteran or this and this and this, and you're like, ooh, that's not my topic. So you can identify a whole bunch of gaps, but if it's
Mhm.
not what you're trying to study, then are you studying the wrong thing? Or is there something else going on? So it's
Mhm.
more like, can you narrow down? And it's hard, but I could, like you and I could Google Scholar or go through, all the
Mhm.
stuff in the libraries and find veteran mental health or veteran
Yeah.
social identity. There's a whole lot of out there. Now, when you maybe get down what's been done in the last 5 years, you may narrow it down, but you really have to, it was like, does that gap mean anything? Or does
Mhm.
that gap apply to what I'm trying to do?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's funny because you have to define terms that is like your field is different than mine, right? I'm human services. So I had to define, what does social support define as? And like, okay, and I had to define, what does peer support mean and what I'm talking about compared to peer support. You know what I mean? So you have to define a lot of stuff.
Mhm.
And however organized you may be, and how you organize your literature, when you're just reading things and stuff, that's you need
Yeah.
to figure it out
Mhm.
because sometimes, it I had Zotero. So, and I've seen people use Excel. This is like, what's the
Mhm.
highlight the keywords? If you figure that out early,
Yeah.
how do you, like, maybe that's a great study, but does that study support my gap, or does it support the literature review or whatever? So you have to know, where does that come into play? And it gets hard because you get in your head, like, it
Mhm.
makes sense to you, it makes sense, and then you get feedback and they're like, no.
Mhm.
And you're like, I was
So,
there.
so what are some of the tactics that your committee, Dr. Strong,
Well,
informed you
I would
would
tell
help
you
you?
that Dr. Strong was my battle buddy. Now,
Yeah.
Dr. Strong has never been in the military day in life.
Mhm.
She was my peer in this process and
Mhm.
stuff. So she finished earlier than me. And I
Mhm.
know it sounds, if you have somebody who's walking this path with you,
Yeah.
whether different levels, different things, have somebody, because I would just say, not just as my committee, I bounced stuff off of her, because we were in classes, because two people can hear something totally different, right?
Mhm.
So you're like, Edwin, what do you think of this and this and this? And you're like, no. And you're like, no. And you have to hear that,
Yes.
no, you don't see it this way. And my committee, and so like Dr. Seabrook was great. And here she's a veteran, so she understands
Mhm.
certain things, but you still have to be able to do this. So she would come back as like, I remember when we had to do those 10 articles, right, like
Mhm.
for our proposal, and she was like, is that really what you want to say, or is that really what the article said? And you're like, yes. And then you're like talking to her, and it's like, well, okay, maybe it said this, and I'm trying to make it more to something else. So there was a lot of, give and take sometimes, but
Mhm.
at the end of the day, I always tell you, it's, you can't so take it personal, even though it feels personal.
Yeah. Because I remember my committee, she was at Air Force, but she had gave me a tip to look in the recommendation section of
Mhm.
previous dissertation. And and the recommendation sections there tell you, well, this topic needs to be studied in like veterans. More
Mhm.
research needed on veterans getting out the military. And she also pointed me to some of the limitations sometimes section might give you a clue of what's needed. Also, when searching for the gap. But those two stick with me the most, especially the recommendation section where she like, explaining how it'll tell you what's needed but hasn't been studied yet. But you there's something key to it has to still be within that 5 year window. So I
And
think for me that did help.
so I was allowed to, now they tell you don't go using dissertations a lot for sources. Doesn't mean
Yes.
that you
Yeah.
can't. It doesn't
Mhm.
mean that you can't because dissertations usually are relatively, I
Mhm.
think exactly the recommendation section, but sometimes to be fair, I found sources that I didn't even know about. If
Mhm.
this was somebody maybe using social identity, it doesn't mean it was directly my population, but they use the same theory. And then it was like, oh, wait,
Mhm.
I didn't
Yeah.
even know about that source. And you're right.
Mhm.
So, when you write your recommendations or, what was the limitation? My limitation was, it's online forums. Or my
Mhm.
limitation, it was only women veterans that had transitioned out of the military within
Yeah.
the last 5 years. Well, if you took my study, right, and you say, well, I'm going to do the gap. The gap may be like, I'm going to build upon my research, meaning that, okay, the limitation was 5 years. Do you get the same results for somebody who's been out 10 years
Mhm.
and stuff? Do you get the same results when you do a male veteran compared to a women veteran? So you can do that, but you still have to have all the research behind why you chose that. Now, that may
Yes.
be like the
Yeah.
gap, and it's like, okay, but you have to still you can't just say, like, oh, I saw Edwin's thing, I'm going to use
Oh,
his
yeah, yeah,
recommendation.
yeah. You can kind
You
of get
have
a
to
general
still build,
idea,
yeah,
but yeah, 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 yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
you still
You
have
just
to
kind of
build
use
that
it.
whole study
Don't
out.
use what they're saying in there, but just kind of get an idea, and you
Yeah.
can do deeper research. And my next question is, though, what are the mistakes you see? Yeah, yeah. And how does a topic that feels too broad actually hide the real gap when it's a broad topic? How can it hide?
Because you don't have a focus. And
Mhm.
I maybe that's so simple to say, but if like we were talking about that triangle thing, but it was like, if
Mhm.
you say veterans mental health for the purposes of that, veterans mental health, what? Okay, your topic is way too broad. Do you want to say rural veterans? Do you want to say transitioning service members? Wait, do they need mental health? Do you
Yes.
want to do the online forms? There's so much more that. So, and that may be one way how new researchers get bogged down because they don't have that research question defined yet, because they don't have
Mhm.
their populations, they don't have what they're doing. And so they're looking at so much stuff, and it's like, okay, come together, come together, come together. You're going to have to really, because otherwise you're going to get out of alignment real
Mhm.
quick. And chapter two is a little rough. Not every chair has everybody start with chapter two. I knew people that they started chapter one. My chair was like, if you do chapter two first, then you
Mhm.
may have to change the wording for chapter one, because all of a sudden your gap or some of your sources, maybe you may find that it's a little different and
Mhm.
stuff. So, if you are broad, you're gonna find a whole lot of studies, but you still don't have your research question yet. So if you don't have your research question, or you
Mhm.
don't really know, then you're out there just I'm
Mhm.
not going to say you're wasting time, because I think all of us have been at that point where you're just like, okay, where do I go to next? So
Mhm.
it
Yeah.
gets, yeah, how you search for something matters, because
Mhm.
the recommendation section is every single study that's peer reviewed, let me say it that way, has been peer reviewed, and there's a recommendation section. Dissertations have been peer reviewed by their chairs, so there
Mhm.
could be a whole lot more stuff out there. I think it's interesting because I get to see how many people have downloaded my work. So it's like, okay, that's cool. Maybe one day I'll go back into Google Scholar and see how my work may or may not have been used. So
Mhm. Do you think it's possible for students to confuse a literature gap with their own reading of the literature?
I think, yeah, well, no, it can be depending on how familiar with your topic. And so, like we always talked about, it's a marathon, not a sprint.
Exactly.
So, if you're reading something and it's veteran related, because both of us are veterans, there's so much out there for veterans, and you're like, oh, okay, that's interesting, and it becomes interesting to use on a personal level, not interesting for a researcher, or it's not interesting for your topic. So,
Mhm.
how you read something is like, well, that's great. That's a whole great thing about mental health. Well, my if my topic is not directly mental health, I'm going to go down a rabbit hole and spend time on something that's not my subject, or it's not what I'm studying. So you have to be careful of the rabbit holes. And I think we've all done it. If you're sort of familiar with your topic, you go here and then also da 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 da, and then you realized, wait, that's not even my topic. So yeah, literally I had to go back, and part of it was like, what is my research question? This is
Mhm.
what I'm supposed to be focusing on,
Mhm.
not all this. So yeah, it can be that rabbit holes happen. I don't think there's anybody out there that's ever done a PhD will tell you that they didn't. All of a sudden you spent 2 or 3 days, or how many times, like looking at articles, and you're like, that's not even my topic.
Yeah,
It's
and it's
veterans mental
something that
health,
can
but
be
that's
more
not my
common
topic.
in the beginning
Yeah.
because you're just starting. So it's always in the beginning that if you're not too familiar or know what you want to, do your research on. But this next segment is I want to go from literature review to the gap statement, and if you can walk us through someone who starts reading broadly, how do they actually narrow toward a topic and a defensible gap?
Mm. So I think it's easy to define population. I mean,
Mhm.
so let me say, first of all, it would be, what are you going to college for? What is your mine is human service, right? So
Mhm.
I am not going to go into anything that's social work focused, right? It doesn't mean certain things are not there. That's not what my degree is in. So, and then Walden, and mine was human service,
Mhm.
concentration, military, families, and culture. So my whole topic had a vote on military, families, and culture. So if you all of a sudden start talking about all the social work stuff, they're like, you're not even in that field. So you have to start there. And then it's like, what do you want? Because I remember in residency one, I was like, hey, and again, I'm so familiar with veterans. They were like, well, what's your topic? And I was like,
Mhm.
women veterans and homeless and da 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 in the rural areas. And I was like, okay, that sounds pretty good. It's like, that's
Mhm.
obviously not what
Yeah.
I ended up with. And, they were like, okay, now what? And you're like, now what? And
Mhm.
and it's like, so when you're first starting out, one, again, understand, what do you go to school for? So don't
Mhm.
go outside of that. If your program has an emphasis, you got to stay within that. So don't go so far out. Now, military families and culture, I could have gone I could
Mhm.
have touched almost anything. So,
Mhm.
but if I started talking about something that didn't have with that, well, there went my topic, right?
Yeah.
And what is something that interests you when you're first starting out? Now, what interests you is it's not what's going to end up
Mhm.
being. And I think the best thing to do
Mhm.
is to be flexible and knowing you're going to evolve. And I think somebody told me, so you're gonna evolve. This topic is going to evolve, because evolve became a better word than change. Because when you change, you're
Mhm.
like, here we go again, something this and something that, and change is constantly going to happen all the way up until your final thing. But if you think about it, so it's you're evolving, your topic is evolving. So if you say, I want to do, I mean, I always say veterans. So if we're going to say like military families, right? What is about military families? Well, I think that we should look at it from this perspective. All right, so then you got to start looking, are there articles? And then more importantly, are there articles within the last 5 years? Because the way that was explained to us is that only your theory can go back that far.
Yeah.
So, is there research within the last 5 years on a topic? Depending on what you're doing, you should know that. You should know that if there's research in the last 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
So, or to be fair, that what they started telling us, depending on if you're early on in the process, your research should only be 3 years old. Why?
Mm-hmm.
Because usually this is 1 year, 2 years. So if you get towards the end, oh, that's now 6 years old. Not using that one. So you could
Mm-hmm.
have lost something that was important. So they said early on for us, look at articles that were like 3 years old.
Mm-hmm.
But you can go into I'm going to say Google Scholar and you could do the daisy chain. Okay, here's this article from 5 years ago. Then you're looking who's citing it to say, how did they use it? And then you can start to look at, oh, there's the recommendation
Mm-hmm.
section. I never thought about that. So you can use Google Scholar. And yes, I use the Walden Library a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Google Scholar to me was something a little simpler at times, but there I had to go get the articles sometimes in Walden's library. But
Mm-hmm.
it was easy to say, oh, that women veterans and so was, oh, that's 8 years old. Oh, wait, here's everybody else who's used it. Let me go. And that is where you can spend the rabbit hole time. Like, oh, okay. And then you're like, oh, I thought this was it. And then you realize somebody from a whole different perspective, a social worker, grabbed my study and used it for
Mm-hmm.
something else.
Yeah.
It's easy, but you should know about, like, you're going to have to get to specifics with your populations, and you can't do a gap without knowing your populations
Mm-hmm.
and who can you research, because IRB is a big thing, and I know this can go to any school out there, but yeah, you're going to defend every single decision you make, which doesn't make a lot of sense when you first start until you get into that and you're like, well, why did you choose 5 years? You
Mm-hmm.
can't just randomly say, well, I chose 5 years because that's the number I liked. No.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be able to, like, why is 5 years important? And you have to have the studies to say, hey, they're saying the transition is 3 to 5 years out of the military, da 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 da. You have to define every single thing. Now, I don't have to define a women veteran, but I have to define it in some ways because
Yeah.
you have to because I couldn't just say the 5 years. Why did I choose 5 years out of the military? Nope.
Mm-hmm.
I had to do the research and look at all the gaps and then look, what did the research tell me? And the research was like, well, the 3 to 5 years out of the military is the deadly gap. So that's how I was like, all right, that's why I chose 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
So it's I think when you have a broad subject, very early in your process, you should start to understand the population
Mm-hmm.
and understand that it's okay to change, because
Yeah.
sometimes you think what you got is good, but is there enough? Can you do a lit review on that subject? Which is easy, hard, depending on your population. So,
Mm-hmm. Yes. So I was how much reading do you think has to exist before you can say that you have an existing gap? Because I know that was my biggest struggle. I'm like, man, I'm printing out like every day. I print out like a stack of articles and I'm reading and still not understanding. Like, man, where's the gap? But how many much do you think? How much reading?
okay. In real talk, did I read all the articles that I looked at?
Mm-hmm.
No, but I read every single abstract and the recommendations.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I may not have gone on, and so that's when you start trying to figure out, what do you have?
Mm-hmm.
Because I was the person, like, I work full time, I still volunteer, still trying to
Yeah.
make all this other stuff happen. So my best thing was, okay, I'm reading every single abstract because the abstract will tell you the population. If you're lucky, it's going to tell you your theory, maybe some or the findings. The findings are going to be there. And then if it got past that, then I'm looking at recommendations. And I think it depends on how good of a researcher you are. And I mean, are you familiar with all the tools? Or to be fair, did you make an appointment with the library? Because early on, that's was one of the my chair recommended, or it was recommended, make an appointment with the library. Because if you're in, a doctoral study, the library is going to be like, well, here, and then all of a
Yes.
sudden
Oh,
you're like,
yes.
whoa, here's a
Hmm.
whole lot of things that I never thought about. So
Hmm.
I would tell you, I would recommend, if you have the ability to make an appointment with your librarian, make an appointment with your librarian, because you're going to tell her
Definitely. Yep.
this,
I was doing
and
it
then
like every
she's going to
week,
give
once
you
a
all the
week.
stuff. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah.
I still have that. So like she emailed that to me. It's one of the
Yeah.
emails that I saved. And it's like, okay, so if I had to
Mhm.
go back, it's like, okay, where did she find all this?
Yeah. Would you say the gap, like we actually touched on it a little bit about the gap can shift once someone commits to a specific the qualitative approach. It can shift where you got the case study, the phenomenology, and grounded theory. It seems like it can shift. Do you think that's true? The possibility of it shifting depending on
Well, I'm
your
going to
approach.
say, until you are locked in, until you're in that proposal and that proposal's done, everything can change. Because like I said,
Oh
I
yeah.
went through all my stuff and then all of a sudden had to change theory. It was like, oh my gosh, now my population and everything, but all of a sudden once you choose theory, or if you use a theory, then, oh wait, social identity theory comes at it from this angle, I have to change something. And
Mhm.
what's the tenets of social identity? And then you have to know why did you choose something? Because I remember thinking like, well, I can't do phenomenology because I was like, women veterans aren't new. So this
Mhm.
is not a new topic. So, that is like case study. It was like case study wouldn't be appropriate for my topic because I'm using online forums. Unless I was only going to use one online forum. And then I'm
Mhm.
getting very specific. So it's like, but you also have to defend, why did you choose what you did? And why theory? Every single decision you made, I was like, oh, well, that. And to be fair, this is when looking at other dissertations sometimes helps. I was like, oh, because you'll read something and was like, oh, well,
Mhm.
that makes sense to me. I mean, it's not a plagiarism thing, it's just you're looking at what they said. And eventually then it was like generic qualitative was like, well, I already have some knowledge of it, so I'm
Mhm.
trying to expand on it because it's like it's part of me. The gap changes based on, did your population change?
Mhm.
And it doesn't mean, so a lot of it is like you have to almost do a complete chapter 2 to really understand your gap, because what you think it is very well could be there, but you have to
Mhm.
prove it in chapter 2.
Yeah.
Because chapter 2 is like, okay, now chapter 3, 4 and 5, you're writing all this stuff, but chapter 2 is where you set the foundation of your study. It's like,
Mhm.
why, where's your gap at? Why? Because it's been researched this way, this way, this way. And then you have to be able to, like, well, why are you researching in this way? Well, chapter 2, you should have some research in there to back up what you say. And I'm the first person, I
Mhm.
think I told you, it took me forever. And it took me forever in chapter 2. And I mean,
Yeah.
forever, because I'm working full time, because I'm volunteering, because I have a life. And
Mhm. Yeah.
the PhD was not the only thing I had going on. And
Mhm.
sometimes it's easy to get burned out on chapter 2 because it
Mhm.
feels like sometimes you're never going to get out of it, or that you think it's like, yes, I got my theory down. And then it comes back and you're like, really? And so
Mhm.
and that's when you can't always take it. And I think the more communication you can have with your chair, overall, the better. I mean, I had phenomenal chairs, and I think the more communication you had, the more there's very clear why are you doing what you're doing.
Mhm. So, Dr. Ballio, today somebody comes up to you and asks, I'm struggling finding my research gap. What is one thing you would tell them to move forward?
And real talk, I'm going to tell you, go to Google Scholar, put your topic
Mhm.
in,
Mhm.
and what comes back. First, do you have a whole bunch of people that are researching your topic? That may
Mhm.
not be a bad thing, but you have to be different than what's already been researched.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
also, in some ways, go to your specific school and look under dissertations and make sure that that topic is not almost already there. Or if it's very close to being there, that yours is different than what's already been done.
Mhm.
Because what you don't want to do is get so far in there and then we're like, well, it's already been researched.
Mhm.
And then you got to start over.
So so earlier your your bio, you work closely with veterans and advocacy focused research. Does finding a gap look different when the research is more personal? Would you say?
I think it's harder because you have to take yourself. It's interesting and harder. It's
Mhm.
interesting because as a veteran, that could have been something. Oh, wow. Okay, let me make sure I'm mark that down. But that could be for personal reasons rather
Yes.
than what you're doing. And it's harder because you cannot say something without backing up because you can't say so just because you're a veteran.
Mhm.
I can't say it's just so because I help veterans find jobs, even though that wasn't my topic. And because, they said you don't have the authority in a dissertation, you don't have the authority to say certain things. Now,
Mhm.
at some point, you could say when you're talking about bias as a women veteran that works with veterans, yes, the biases are there. And you have to be able to say, that's why you have an audit trail. That's why when you set up your questions, that's why you have every single thing printed out. That's why your chair looks it over to make sure that you're not inserting you and you are literally only responding to what they said.
Mhm.
It's easy. It's harder, actually. I found it actually about the second or third one. I got pretty good at it. In your
Mhm.
interviews, when you're like, so they, unless they found me on LinkedIn, which they could already tell I was a veteran, but some people could have been referral and they don't really know anything about me. So when they're answering my research questions, I have to take me out of that.
Yes.
Until you've done it like a couple, it's a little bit
Yeah.
harder than what you think, but that's why
Mhm.
they said that's why you have the recording,
Mhm.
whatever type of that you're using, and then that's why you have your notes, because
Yeah.
you may think this is what they're saying and then you have to go back and say, "Oop, nope, that was wrong. They
Yeah.
literally said A, B,
Mhm.
C, not what you thought as a veteran they said."
That was actually one of my limitations is, you know, when you're doing your topic on veterans, that was one of the limitations that I listed is me getting too close and involved, and having to not include myself and learning to just think of it as, this is research that I'm conducting to, make a contribution. So that's what made me take myself out of it. But I think that can be a limitation for some people, when you have to state the limitations. And that's actually tied to the next question I would ask. How do you help a researcher hold both closeness to the topic and the process required?
So I would hope that starts early on in the process.
Mhm.
So you know what I mean? Sometimes when we randomly if I'm doing my
Mhm.
job and somebody asks me a question, and it's like, well, how far down, where are you at in the thing? Because early on it's easy to change somebody. What happens
Yes.
is later on in the process, that person could be really, really frustrated that
Mhm.
I can't get out of chapter two. I'm not seeing this. And it's not, and I'm going to say and many of the dissertations I looked at,
Mhm.
Some of, not counting chapter 2, because chapter 2 will be unique to every single person. When you
Mhm.
get down to 1, 3, 4, and 5, there's certain wording that's certain wording. Right
Mhm.
now, it's like, okay, make sure you have this, this, and this. And Walden gives you some of those topics, like that when they give the
Mhm.
templates, they know it's like, okay, what does the wording say? I think
Mhm.
you have to like sit somebody down with sort of like when I do a resume sometimes, right? I'll sit somebody down and say, well, tell me what you did. And they'll give me this,
Mhm.
this, and this. And then I'll flip the resume over and I'm like, well, you told me all the stuff and only about half of them are on the resume. So
Yeah.
sometimes it's like with the PhD, okay, where are you at in it? I mean, literally, where are you at? And then if you got
Mhm.
to the point where you're actually in the dissertation phase, and you have to understand what the process is. Well, tell me what you've done, tell me your topic, and why is it important? Because you
Mhm.
got to start there. And if you can't,
Yes.
and if you, it's hard until you're doing it. And then it becomes harder. And then you get to a point you're like, got it. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? Because you got to go through your chair. Then you got to go through your methodologist. And then
Yeah.
hopefully they're talking to each other. And I mean, my methodologist helped me with my data. And
Mhm.
Dr. Shermack was my methodologist and she was great because
Mhm.
I was almost I got a little frustrated to be fair. And in
Yeah.
some ways, that's why, I mean, Dr. Strong now, Reese and stuff like that, I gave her a shout out because talking to somebody else in the PhD will actually help you because sometimes you realize your struggles are not your own.
Mhm.
Everybody goes through this. I tell people, I said, to be fair, if you go through a PhD program and you didn't question yourself a couple of times, did you
Mhm.
really participate? Now, I know
Mhm.
there's people out there that, you know what I mean? There's people out there that's fine. But I'm like, there's points and you're like, why am I doing this? And sometimes you can
Mhm.
get right back out of your head, but it's just like,
Mhm.
it's like,
Yeah.
it can be for those ones that have the money
Mhm.
stuff. Everybody's trying to pay for certain things. It's like I can't get along, or wait, they have 2 weeks to come back, and I'm trying to get this done because I'm trying to get this done. Like, well, they have other, and then
Mhm.
sometimes the rumor you're not their only student. You
Yeah.
know, they have time frames, and then there. So I think the
Mhm.
more communication at the beginning, and also just be able to explain it. Now,
Mhm.
it may be like you just need to have that file on your computer. So if somebody asks you, like, okay, let me go back. Because like, to be fair, like when you posted on LinkedIn, you made the comment about like the different theories, right? I
Mhm.
was like, I know. And I had to go back. So I almost like copied mine, but I had to go back even a year later to go back to like, why did I choose grounded? And I was like, okay, let me at least share that with you on your post. It was like,
Yeah.
okay, if you have some pre knowledge, you're going to
Mhm.
have to state that. And then you're going to have to then that's why a generic qualitative inquiry worked for me.
Mhm.
Because I was already saying, I can't deny, even if it was all about male veterans,
Mhm.
still did 20 years in the army. You say you would like try not to see things through a lens, and you see things through a lens which helps and can hurt you at the same time.
True. Yeah. What would you say to a veteran of a first generational doctoral who feels like their story isn't academic enough to even be a legitimate gap?
Well, I think that's when you pause, you know what I mean? So it's
Mhm.
like then you have and I'm going to use the words because I'm not trying to minimize, and I'll just use, you have to break that stuff down kindergarten style. Tell me what it is. Tell me what is your field? What is it you're trying to study? And what do you think the gap is? And then can you give me, maybe you can lay it, can you give me the 10 sources that support your gap?
Mhm.
Because those 10 sources you can build on, or give me sources that support your gap. Let's see
Yeah.
where you found it at. Because if you can't, your sources, like you said, recommendations. Well, that source may be a recommendation. They said, well, it can be used in this way. Okay. Now, is there anybody else doing that? And then we're going to build something around you can't build something around 2 to 3 sources.
Mhm.
Not for now, not for a PhD, you can't. You know what I mean? Because then
Yeah.
you can start there. Well, they said like doing mail veterans with social identity theories and online forums. Okay.
Mhm.
Okay, now you know, but do you have an are you building upon lit reviews to be able to define that? So I mean, do you have tell me the sources where you're choosing your gap? Because you have to define it,
Mhm.
but and if you're doing the recommendations, is that strong enough of a recommendation to build a PhD on?
Mhm.
And that's probably what I would start with somebody really frustrated in the process. It's like, okay, let's break
That's
this
good
one down.
sound advice. I like that. I like that. That's true. Yeah.
Let's
It's
break
like
it.
you're giving them
Let's
that start somewhere.
Right. So, I mean, where did you start from? And it doesn't mean that you were
Mhm.
right or wrong. It just means, okay, you started, but now we got to take it somewhere. So you got to think your research gap is why you want to something. Now but you don't know, that's not your findings. The gap just says,
Mhm.
why should this be studied?
Mhm.
And if you can sort of like, why should it be studied? Because it's never been A, or they're not doing C, or they're not doing E, F, and G, then okay, that may be
Mhm.
your gap. So,
Like I say, it's not an intelligence issue, it's a clarity issue. You just need that clarity. And that clarity, once you start getting that clarity, everything starts opening up and you start understanding. It's like that fog moves, clears. So
well,
I,
and,
I would
and
I would leave what I asked you just to be with this. If someone watching tonight, what's and what's one of the takeaways about finding the research gap would you want them to know? What's one takeaway?
it's okay to look at recommendations of a studies. That's where you
Mhm.
start at. That's where you
Mhm.
start at. But a recommendation for a future study is not a PhD.
Mhm.
Find it and then can you build on it? So,
Exactly.
I mean, the recommendations are great, but every single study, okay, I could be wrong, every single peer
Mhm.
reviewed study has a recommendation section. Every
Mhm.
dissertation has a recommendation section. So you're going to have to look at several of those
Mhm.
and then really figure out what your gap is.
Yeah.
Stuff, but your gap could be like, hey, transition challenges. Oh, and
Mhm.
I would tell you, so you have to really, okay, just because you found a gap that you like
Yes.
doesn't mean that that gap will
Mhm.
work because you have to
Yeah.
build and you have to be able to, and if you choose a dissertation to look at for recommendations, because I think all of us have looked at other dissertations.
Mhm. Yeah.
You bet. I mean, that's why you have to be your interview guide. That's why you have to have all of your stuff. Or how did
Mhm.
you get to something?
Mhm.
You, I don't know much places that will allow you to duplicate a dissertation and just using different
Mhm.
populations, which would be a
Yeah.
recommendation. So, but if you find that recommendation to be interesting, just know that you can use some of the bare bones of that dissertation, but now you have to bring it to a different direction.
Mhm. So pretty much to sum it up, research gaps are built from the literature, are built more from the literature, and they're not, you don't find them by accident. It's like you build up to it. And that's something in the beginning I didn't understand until, like I said earlier, I started getting that clarity. So I want to thank you for this topic, and you stated great points. I hope that those that are listening was taking notes because you gave a big picture, and a roadmap to building finding that gap. And before we leave, though, I want to, if you can just tell people where they can find you, with your socials, if
Well, I would tell you probably the easiest way to get me at the moment, while there's other stuff in progress that's not
Yes.
there. I am on LinkedIn. Just my
Mhm,
first name, first name, last name. It's probably easier, and you can probably just send me a message on there. Um,
mhm,
I just I just know that I work full time and I do all this volunteer stuff. So everything on LinkedIn's more, on the professional side.
mhm.
Face planted about 3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
About 4 weeks
Yeah.
ago. That's the last bit. That's on my
Mhm.
that's on Facebook.
Yeah.
So I am there. But and I'm never not gonna help somebody because I know along the way somebody helped me.
Yes.
So, if they have questions, then definitely, reach out and I will try and help them give that way.
Mhm. But it was something else. Yeah, can you repeat your dissertation topic one more time?
Ah, you're gonna make me here. How's that? You know what? I'm going to tell people, I said, I'll send it to you, Edwin. If you're more interested in my research topic, hit me up on LinkedIn and I will give you the topic. How's that? And
Okay.
everything.
Awesome.
But the gist of the topic was about women veterans and their use of online forums for social
Mhm.
identity after they transition out of the military.
Okay.
So, in other words, population theory and the time frame right
Okay.
there in your little words. But if you want, I mean, yeah, because you forget what the 16 was, the amount of characters and stuff. But yeah, my thing was on women veterans, and you'd be surprised how much harder it is when you start using online forums because it's there and what you think is there is not there and to back it up. So when you start doing topics that are not new, online
Mhm.
forums are not new, period. But to find the research that's focusing on online forms took a little bit to get there.
And I forgot. I'm so excited about this topic. I forgot to introduce myself. So I'm real quickly. The closing. My name is Dr. Edwin Brown. I am the founder of Quality Coach. And for those that are looking for resources, whether you're a undergrad, a graduate, a doctoral student, and you need a direction, you can reach me at qualitycoaches.com, or you can subscribe to my YouTube channel, Quality Coach, for weekly topics on dissertation and topic developments and your uh, research approaches. With that being said, this was a great conversation. I'm looking forward to many more, and I hope you enjoy your Sunday.
And thank you for having me on.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure.